When Election Day finally rolls around and you head into the polling station and get your ballot, what moves you to pick one candidate over another? Hope, fear, a reasoned analysis of the options, or maybe just habit? There's more going on than meets the eye. Here to help us better understand the psychology of the choices we make, we welcome Peter Lowen. He is director of the University of Toronto's School of Public Policy and Governance. Anna Esselment, associate professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Waterloo, and Elisha Corbett. She's a PhD student at Queen's University whose dissertation focuses on political rebranding. And we are happy to welcome you two on the ends back here to TVO. And Elisha, for the first time, nice to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
Anna, to you first, how rational are voters when making decisions on who to vote for?
Well, for the most part, the evidence shows that we're actually not that rational. So if we think about rationality, we would think of a person who would look at all of the campaign platforms, if they were all available, look at the costing, think about how that would affect their lives.
That was a little shot at the PCs there, wasn't it? I just read between the lines there, if they were available. Okay,
right,
I got
but
it.
we would think about all of these things, and then we would make a decision based on what really worked for us. So we can't all do that. We are busy, we don't all have the capacity to do it, we're not all interested. So what we do is we actually take a rational route to make what ends up being a bit of an irrational decision, where we use information shortcuts or heuristics to help us make decisions. So for some people, that will be a partisan identification. They might identify with the NDP, and that they just need to know that, and that's how that will help determine their vote. Some voters will go with endorsements. So if it's a group that they really like, and that group, they like Greenpeace, and Greenpeace endorses the Green Party, that's enough for a voter to match themselves up with that party. It could be polling, in the sense that polling in the aggregate will at least let a voter know who's viable in the election. And sometimes it can even just be appearance, a candidate's appearance. It could be whether they look strong, whether they have leadership skills, those sorts of things. And that helps voters make their decisions.
That sounds very much like a rational calculation, though. And most of what we hear nowadays is that anger motivates people, or fear, or something in the gut as opposed to the brain.
Yeah, so exactly. So you can have these emotions, you can feel anxious, and then use a shortcut like, how's the economy doing, or how are my personal finances doing? And that will help you sort of line up in terms of being able to make a decision on a candidate.
What are the emotions that you see factoring into a political judgment on Election Day?
Yeah, so I would echo what Dr. Esselment said, that we have this assumption that we are rational creatures and we make rational decisions when we are given a set of facts. But what I found in my research is that brands are a really good heuristic for voters. So any emotion that they're feeling, if there's a party that has that sort of emotional attachment for them, that's how they'll make their decision.
Isn't that, Peter, less and less the case nowadays, that the emotional connection we might have had to a party 10 years ago doesn't necessarily last that long anymore?
Yeah, I'm not sure it's an emotional connection necessarily, but the nature of people's partisanship is different. And my own sense, I mean, the American case is different than the Canadian one, but to contextualize the American case, what's happening is that there's increasingly partisan polarization. People are much more consistently partisan than they were before, if they are partisan. But their partisanship is becoming a social identity. So it's not only about their politics, but it's about who they understand themselves to be and who they understand other members of their party to be. And it's increasingly becoming something that's affective, that really is colored by their emotions. That's less the case in Canada, but we have had in the recent past, we have now sometimes very polarizing politicians who elicit very strong emotional reactions. I think a lot of the opposition to Kathleen Wynne is rooted in deep emotional reactions to her as a politician. I think the same thing can be said for Mr. Ford. The more people get to know politicians, the more they can often develop a series of emotions and emotional attachments to those politicians, and those guide their behavior.
In which case, how do voters, based on your research, how do voters know what they want to really focus on and say, my decision will be dependent on these things? And how do they decide, okay, none of this stuff matters over here, I'm not going to worry about any of that, and that won't affect my decision at all?
Yeah, so let me give you a bit of an analogy. So, next time you have a friend who's just bought a car, just ask them what they like about the car and why they bought it, and they'll show you, and they'll open it up and say, oh, look, it's got this really neat cup holder that comes out of the console for the people in the back seat. I mean, as though that was ever a consideration when they were buying the car, right? They probably were running on some instinct. They had some base preferences. They saw something they liked. And having bought it, having made that decision, or in the run-up to that decision, they find reasons for why they're going to make that decision. And a lot of politics and a lot of campaigns is about giving voters reasons for the decisions that they've already made or that they're going to make. That's the job of politicians, right? And when a politician tells you the issue in this election is X, or the thing you should be thinking about when you vote is Y, is actually not so much about them trying to get you to deliberate over that issue and see that they're on the right side of it. It's to give people who are going to vote for them a reason for why they're going to vote for them, because ultimately people are going into voting booths and they're trying to feel like they're making a reasoned choice. And when they're talking about politics, they can't simply say all the time, well, I just kind of like that person better than the other person. There has to be more substance to that. So a lot of what we do is make decisions on instinct, and sometimes we delay that actual decision right up to the voting booth, so we've probably got a choice we're going to make. And politics helps us back out the reasons for why we do that. And sometimes it's issues, sometimes it's personality, sometimes it's scandal. But for the most part, it's politicians who are organizing the world for us.
It feels, Anna, like we're in a time right now, and I guess Donald Trump's election would be the best example of this, that if we like a candidate, it doesn't matter how wrong they might be on an issue, it doesn't matter how stupid something they say is, it doesn't matter whether 1,000 facts line up against them and maybe 2 facts are on their side, they're still going to hang on to those 2 facts come hell or high water. Why is that happening now?
So I think that's probably actually something that's happened for a long time. So if we can use an analogy, and it's a common one in political science, but for those voters who do have a preference, and it could be a partisan preference or it's a candidate preference, you start hearing the information and receiving the information through the lens of that preference. So if we take Toronto Maple Leafs and the Ottawa Senators, if you're a Leafs fan, every call that the ref is going to make on the ice, Leafs fans, if it's against that team, they're not going to like it. They're going to say, ref, you're not watching the game, even if on the replay it's clearly the case that the puck went in. So I think so politics is actually not that much different. We see it through a lens, which means that voters will often perceive or receive information from the candidate or the party, and they will accept that.
Why does it seem to be so hard to let go of what are clearly false beliefs in those cases? The facts all line up one way, but damn it, we're going the other way, and we don't care what the facts say.
I would say because of emotion. Like, emotions play such a central role in political decision making. So if you're feeling anxious and you're feeling stressed about the economy, and somebody like Doug Ford comes along and says, I'm going to fix the economy, even though all the facts point up that maybe he doesn't have a platform to do so, if he's telling you and he's appealing to those that feeling of anxiety, you're likely gonna vote for him.
Peter,
Go ahead, Anne.
And then Peter too.
Yeah, I think the second point that comes from what Elisha was saying is that we often mistake familiarity for truth too. So things that are familiar to us, we tend. It's hard to distinguish that from truth. So when politicians repeat a message, it becomes very familiar to us. And then because our cognitive, we're kind of lazy about how we think about things in many respects, we just automatically respond. The familiar becomes very truthful to us, and that's it can then be hard for a voter to shift their mindset, because it means they have to think a whole lot more about it. And again, many of us have neither the time nor perhaps even the interest to do that. Or the
inclination to do so. And Ford Nation is a well-known, familiar, comfortable brand for a good chunk of Ontarians, so it's not surprising to hear that. What would you add to this in terms of why it's so hard for us to let go of facts and go with our gut instead?
I think we should be respectful of voters in the sense that people who have made a choice and have made a preference are making an emotional investment, and they're making a personal investment in a candidate. And that's an important part of our process, and we've got to respect that. And I'm saying that that anyone here is disrespecting, but we've got to respect the fact that people have decided to put their faith in somebody. And a lot of us, when we're personally invested in people, ignore a lot of evidence to the contrary about their character, and we focus on the good things, and that's a pretty good human practice in some ways, right? To forget about the bad stuff and focus on the good stuff. Doesn't mean that we can necessarily come up with good, reasoned, balanced, objective judgments of performance by politicians, but I understand why voters are doing it.
In which case, Elisha, clearly there have been minds changed during the course of this campaign, right? Wherever the numbers started, that's not where they are right now. So what does it take to get voters to change their minds about various things?
I think we have sort of preferences, like Dr. Esselment was saying. We have these preferences that we already go into the election with, and we sort of get whatever it takes to rationalize that. I think for people to change their minds during an election, I think it either takes some type of crisis, so a scandal that really changes the course of the election, or I think it takes a really strong party brand. So what we're seeing right now is Liberal voters who might be unhappy with Kathleen Wynne, if they see a really strong brand that's appealing to their emotions on either side of the spectrum, that's what it takes, I think.
How about for you? Why do they change their minds?
Well, I think in this case, you do have some voters that are undecided, and you would have some that might have a partisan identification. But again, if you use that heuristic where it's polling, and I mean, you could have a whole other segment on polling. But so for people who may still identify with the Liberals, for example, what they're seeing now is how this election is starting to become a two-horse race. Mm-hmm. And that might cause them to say, even though I identify Liberal, this election, because the person who I really don't want to win, you know, I'm going to have to actually vote a different way in order to prevent the person who I really don't prefer.
So I'm not going to vote for who I want,
Yeah.
but I really can't stand that person.
Right.
But since who I want's not going to win, I'm going to go somewhere else.
Right, and what's interesting, there's not actually a lot of strategic voting. Like the evidence is not that a whole lot of us can really determine in our own ridings whether it's a three-horse race or a two-horse race. But the polling generally, when we see, especially, you know, last week when it's NDP and the PCs really becoming neck and neck, that is a signal to some voters who might have an affiliation with the Liberals that they're going to change their mind and support the NDP on this one. Or potentially.
It's doing two things at once, right? It's doing the thing you're talking about, I think, which is that people are, you know, they're saying, I want to stop Ford and I got to plump with the NDP to do that. And
Right.
it's a tactical thing. But there's another part of it, which is the more emotional thing, which is that people are saying, well, what, all these other people are voting for Horwath. Why? Why are they voting for her, right? And it's a completely reasonable human thing to say, a bunch of other humans like this option, I should re-examine it and see if I like it. You know, when you're going to buy something, and you want to buy something that's good, you sort of, you know, you wouldn't be persuaded if someone comes along and says, you know, no one else buys this actually, right? This is it's very, you know, they could buy it, but no one else chooses it. So when we have these polling effects, part of it is people being tactical, but part of it is people updating their actual preferences, saying other people like me appear to be changing their vote. Maybe I should change my vote too. I think sometimes we sort of run down bandwagon effects, but they're it's a completely reasonable way to make a decision, right? To look what other people are doing and to reevaluate on
I
that.
hear you on that, but what seems to be so far fascinating about this campaign is that if you consider 39 out of 41 Ontario elections have been won by the same two parties, right? It's Liberals and Tories 39 out of 41 times. So the notion of, you know, only for the third time ever, people are taking a second harder look at the party they never normally consider, that's different.
That's different. Yeah, no, I mean, it marks something exceptional. And I think there's a whole confluence of things there. But what you have, I think, in the main, what the animating forces are that people are tired of the incumbent government, for better or for worse. They've been in power a long time. So even leaving aside objective performance, they're tired of them. But they're worried about the alternative on the right. And they're worried about whether Doug Ford is up to the task. And it's not about policy so much as it is about making judgments about him, I think. And they're looking at Horwath, who is, you know, a pretty seasoned campaigner. So if ever you were kind of like asking yourself, let's blue sky it, what are the conditions under which the NDP can win an election? This is it.
Yeah, and I think some data that's come out too from firms like Abacus Data are showing that Ontarians are also, they're not afraid of an Andrea Horwath government. So I think the legacy, the Bob Rae, I think that has actually faded a fair amount in the distance. And Ontarians are open to the NDP in this election.
Well, I think the fact of the matter is one of us at this table wasn't alive when Bob Rae was elected the Premier of Ontario in 1990.
It's true, I wasn't.
Right? Very good, very good. I want to talk about fear, because one of the things we hear a great deal about, Elisha, is that, and we're hearing about it more here tonight, people make decisions for a whole bunch of reasons, but one of the things that's really on the move these days is fear as a motivator for voting. You seeing that?
Absolutely. We've seen it around the world. We've seen it in the US. We've seen it in parts in Europe. And I think we're seeing it here now in Ontario. This rise of populism really plays into citizens' fear and their anxiety about the economy, about the future. And so what that does is it allows a populist leader to come to the front and sort of tap into those emotions.
I've never heard of it quite put this way, but what about neuroticism? Is that on the march out there?
So there's been this new paper that's been published that actually studied personality of voters, and what they discovered is that voters who are more prone to depression or anxiety, therefore, and then labeled neurotic, I guess, in a way. Also, their voting behavior then is such that they are supporting more right of center parties.
I got a snippet from this study.
Okay.
Can I read?
Yeah.
Let's read this snippet here, and then we'll come back and chat about it a little bit more. Social, Psychological, and Personality Science Journal published this past March. Regions high in neuroticism were more likely to vote in the populist direction. The role of regional neuroticism in predicting voting behavior has not been identified before, suggesting that it could have been a latent factor lying dormant until the right conditions, in this case, populist political campaigns, were realized. In other words, neuroticism seems to exert a quote-unquote sleeper effect, with the potential to have a profound impact on the geopolitical landscape, especially in light of the rise of populism across the globe. I mean, that really does seem to hit it on the head, doesn't it?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I think it's new. I haven't actually been able, I haven't looked at their methodology or their data or anything at this point, but Peter and I were talking about this earlier, and I think the word populism is really, it's used a lot in the last little bit. And there are different kinds of populisms on the spectrum.
2 different examples in this campaign.
Well, exactly. So populism, at least as far as I'm concerned, really is sort of an approach to politics. And it's anti-elite, and you're there for the little guy. And so I think what they're tapping into in this study is that right-wing populism, as described by some scholars, is not only that approach, but they also tend to blame an outgroup for the problems of the underdog, the regular voters. And so once you've blamed that group, you can stoke fears about they've taken your jobs, they're infiltrating your border.
Now, Trump did that, but do you see that happening in this Ontario campaign?
So my analysis of this Ontario campaign is that Doug Ford has some parallels to Trump. He's sloganeering. He's doesn't cost anything.
Rich businessman?
Yeah, sort of that. Yeah, exactly. Rich businessman. I don't see the blatant use of racism in the Ontario campaign by Trump or by Doug Ford as we saw with Trump. And I think we have to be careful when we talk about populism that we don't want to say that because we label someone a populist that it actually means what Trump did when he was going through the 2016 election. But that's not to say that, and I think what these researchers and these scholars are finding is that and this is common, if you feel anxious, your threat mechanism within your brain, you hear rattlesnakes and you're on a hike, immediately you're sort of ready for a threat. And it causes you to assess the situation, you're more critically assessing, and therefore more open to making different choices. And I think that this is what they're getting at here too.
Do you see a kind of neuroticism in Ontario right now that the 2 populist parties have picked up on?
No, I want to say, I guess, just two things quickly about the paper. Because it relates to this case in particular. One is that it's not as though people haven't looked at neuroticism and voting behavior before. It's just that it typically hasn't kicked up any significant results. But other personality traits will. But the other thing is that I think that I've read a lot of this literature, and the trouble is a lot of it comes out of America, where I think that genuinely there is a strong link made between people who have negative affectivity or people who are generally nervous about the world and conservatism. But that's not a natural link in any sense, right? Think about the rhetoric of Canadian campaigns. Think about how many campaigns we've fought over with center-left parties telling old voters, don't vote for those parties because they'll take away your pensions and take away your health care. Literally, they're threatening them with things that are almost existential and saying, worry, 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 be fearful. That's the politics of fear, right? So how the politics of fear is linked into policy preferences is different in different countries. And I think it's organized around kind of what the central concerns are in countries. So in America, where there's lots of concerns about crime, lots of concerns that are underwritten by issues of race, fearfulness can tend people towards conservatism. I'm not sure it obviously tends them towards conservatism in Canada. I think that said, there is an element of populism which is not so much about fearfulness as it is about alarmism, a sense that something is broken and things are going in the wrong direction, a worry over the future, and a sense that the system is at its core kind of broken. And that's something that may appeal more to people who are negatively affected, people who have neuroticism, or it may just appeal to everyone who kind of believes that argument. So it's hard to separate out how much of it is people being angry at the time, kind of a mood, versus their state of being neurotic. But I think we just have to be charitable about it and acknowledging that politicians on all sides of the political spectrum like to use fear when they can. Because it's an effective emotion.
Well, it works.
It's an effective emotion.
The fact is, it works. Alicia, I want to just spend a few moments with you right now on, because you are doing your PhD in political rebranding. So I want to spend a little time just looking at that. I want to compare, because you've already brought up the example of, in some respects, shopping for a new car and shopping for a new politician. A lot of the same things go into that. How do corporations and political parties compare when it comes to the strategies that they use to make us feel a certain way?
I would say they're almost identical. So with corporations, what you see is a brand is essentially just how it's a complex set of intangible emotions, feelings, and values that are attached to tangible things like products or companies. And when we have mass production and mass consumption, consumers need to be able to not only identify but differentiate that company's brand to stay competitive, essentially, in the market. So the most obvious example of this in the market would be Tim Hortons and Starbucks, because both sell the exact same product, which is coffee.
They would dispute that. But anyway.
But they make people feel very different ways, and you actually have people who are very loyal to their brands. You have people who go to Timmy's every morning, and you have people that go to Starbucks every morning. And the same holds true for political parties. So parties need to build brand loyalty in voters. They need voters to be able to identify who their leader is, what their platform is, and how it's different and even better than other parties.
And it's interesting, the political parties actually line up behind those two different brands as well. You would never catch Stephen Harper in a Starbucks.
Absolutely.
He would only go to Tim Hortons.
Absolutely.
Let's extend this then to the federal political scene for now. When you think about John Turner, Jean Chrétien, Paul Martin, Michael Ignatieff, Stéphane Dion, I mean, that's a certain type of political leader you have in mind. The Liberals went through a pretty massive rebranding when Justin Trudeau became the leader. So you've studied that. What jumps out at you about the way they rebranded?
Well, one is that they completely rebranded.
They sure did.
And what's interesting, what I found in my research, which I wasn't able to find for any other party in any other election, was an actual branding manual. So the Liberal parties had this public manual of how they brand. And in it defined what branding is, why we brand, and it was called Bold, Modern, and Fresh. And that's exactly what Justin Trudeau is. And that was reflected in their logos, in their font choices, in the images. And what that manual did was it said, if you're running an event at a school, this is the image we want you to use. The logo can only ever appear here, but if it's a black and white photo, the logo has to be more opaque. Like it's very strict.
They had it figured out down to the nth degree, eh?
Exactly, and what that shows is that their brand is becoming more sophisticated, and it really does have that bold, modern, and fresh feel to it.
And let's do one more before I get the others in as well. You know, the biggest sort of personal brand in Ontario right now, if you like, that has a trade name is Ford Nation. What do you think of that brand?
I think it is a very successful brand right now. So what Ford has done is he has tapped into those fears, and he's branded himself as the guy for the little people, right? He's all about getting rid of Hydro One CEO, but he doesn't actually have concrete facts or a policy platform, right? But that brand seems to appeal to voters. I mean, we don't have any data yet on how successful it is, but just by looking at the polls, we see that Ontarians like Doug Ford.
Yeah, he connects with a bunch of people who are of a particular demographic.
Yeah.
In which case, let's continue that analysis. Does Andrea Horwath have a brand in the way that Doug Ford has Ford Nation as a brand?
I would say no, she doesn't actually, and that's probably been part of the struggle for Andrew Horwath and the NDP in the last number of elections. I mean, we have a competitive party system, but until, I mean, it's only actually been in the last week or two that Ontarians know who she is.
Isn't that crazy? She's the longest serving of all three leaders.
Yeah.
And yet, pollsters picked that up. A lot of people didn't know who she was.
I mean, Patrick Brown had that problem too. He doesn't have that anymore. But again, it was about Ontarian voters, whether they even know her. So I don't think their brand has been as strong, and still is not that strong, aside from the fact that in this particular election, people are now turning and saying she's the better alternative. And in fact, if you think about a slogan or a brand, it's essentially the NDP saying, we're the best. You can have bad or you can have worse.
We're not them.
Or us. Yeah, we're not them. So I don't think her brand is actually that strong.
What's the Premier's brand?
Oh, I think her brand, that's a good question. How does she conceive of herself? I mean, I think what she's selling, if we want to use such a coarse verb, is that she is a person who knows her files well, is passionate, believes that government has a function, but that it's hard work and government policy choices matter. I think that's, I mean, you could put it more succinctly and you could put it with a little more elegance and color, but it doesn't really light up the sails right now.
The campaign manager for the Liberals, David Hurley, said weeks ago, I have the toughest job of all of the campaign managers because, frankly, our party's been in office for 15 years. The Premier's been the Premier for 5 years and 100 days or so. And you know, the public's impression of them is pretty baked in at this stage. So how does he reintroduce her in a positive? How would you rebrand the Wynne government? I mean, admittedly, it's 9 days left to go, but how would you do it?
I think what they did more at the beginning of the election, purely from an academic theoretical perspective, was successful in the sense that if you look at the advertisements of the Liberal Party, they very rarely show Kathleen Wynne, if at all, actually. And that signifies that they're trying to brand more so about the party rather than the leader. And you even see that in the rhetoric. So Kathleen Wynne will say, we have done this, we are going to do this, whereas Ford and Horwath, in their advertisements, focus a lot on the leader.
Absolutely.
And they use more of the rhetoric of, I'm going to do this when I become Premier. So it's putting the emphasis on the leader brand versus the party brand.
They have tried to, over the, I was going to say months, but in fact years, they have tried to rebrand Kathleen Wynne in a variety of different ways. She was kind of new and different and exciting when she first became Premier. Then, after a while, she was, trust me, I have the safe hands that can steer this economy through a difficult time. And now, I mean, obviously, in the lead up to this election, given what the numbers were suggesting, was a rebranding even possible?
I think a rebranding in this instance was going to be very difficult. And I think that actually has to do with our party system in one way too, because you can have governments, and we've had them in Ontario, but if you look at Alberta, and you've got the Progressive Conservatives that forever, they were the only game in town. So even if you were in government for a long, long time, the competition wasn't the same when you were in an election. And in this case, we've got a competitive party system, and it's true, 15 years in, with a whole lot that all the parties can point to, and a Premier with personal, like her personal popularity numbers are low, it's really hard to rebrand. They started off, with the change. She even tried to, change worked in 2014 because she was changed from Dalton McGuinty. And I think they initially tried to keep that moving at the beginning, but now have kind of given up and just tried to go back to that whole steady hand. And, everything's not perfect, but still things are pretty good.
Peter, I got a minute left for you to tell me why casting a ballot is like ordering ice cream.
Well, I'll just tell you that I sort of never choose what ice cream I'm going to choose. I eat a lot of ice cream, but I never choose what ice cream I'm going to have until you're right in front of the teller and they say, which do you want, right? But it turns out I more or less always choose from a very small range of things, right? If you really pushed me on it, I would know what I was going to have. But the point is that the decision's not made until you're asked. And a lot of voters will go into the voting booth not really knowing what they're going to do, but they know as soon as they're asked. They like to live with that uncertainty, or they like to turn it over more and more and more. But the minute you ask, they order the same thing.
They will be asked on June the 7th. Whether they like strawberry, chocolate, or vanilla, or however, whatever metaphor we want to use. I want to thank Anna Esselment for making the struggle to get here from the University of Waterloo, which used to be back in the day about an hour away, and now it's sometimes 2.5 hours away. Thanks for making the trip to Toronto.
Thank you.
Peter Lowen, Director of the University of Toronto School of Public Policy and Governance, and Elisha Corbett, whom we wish good luck in finishing her PhD at Queen's University on political rebranding. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.